And so it turned out that only a life similar to the life of those around us, merging it without a ripple, is genuine life, and that an unshared happiness is not happiness. Welcome back to another episode of the Nomad's Notebook podcast. My name is Joe Maxwell, and today we're going to talk about the intriguing story of a young man named Christopher Mccandless. We'll discuss his unorthodox and very tragic life, the terrifying implications of childhood abuse, along with 3 life-changing lessons that we can learn from him. Chris Mccandless' story has become mainstream since the release of a book called Into the Wild and a subsequent movie that came out years after that by the same title. Now, if you've found my podcast, then you've probably at least heard of this story, but if you haven't, that's totally okay too, no worries. I was about 10 years old when I first became aware of Into the Wild. My older brother was interested in the story at that time, and we watched the movie together. As a kid, I remember being intrigued by it, but I maybe wasn't yet old enough to really grasp the depth of Chris's life, and I actually completely forgot about it for probably the next 10 years or so. Fast forward, one night, I'm lying in bed in my college dorm room, and I saw Into the Wild on Netflix. Remembering how much I had enjoyed it as a child, I decided I'd give it a watch. Since then, it's become one of my favorite movies ever. I've rewatched it several times, and I've even read the book a couple times as well. For anyone who's not familiar with the story, I'll just recap it now quickly, just so that the rest of this makes sense. Into the Wild is about a young man named Chris Mccandless. On the surface, Chris's life appears to check all the boxes that one might look at. He comes from a very wealthy, upper middle class family. He has a younger sister and 2 loving parents. Or at least that's how it appears to anyone on the outside looking in. Chris graduates from Emory University with a very promising future ahead of him. He has $25,000 in the bank, which is a lot for someone his age, and you got to remember this is happening in the early 90s. His grades are more than good enough to get into any law school that he wants, and for anyone who's close to him, family and friends, that's the path that they expect him to take. Then something changes. Out of nowhere, Chris suddenly disappears, seemingly off the face of the earth. He doesn't answer his parents' letters and their many phone calls, and they quickly become very worried, right? Just wondering where he is. And they actually launch a full investigation into his whereabouts. But all they can find is a record from a local charity that shows all of his savings were donated. It wouldn't be until much, much later that they would discover what became of Chris. After he graduated college, Chris Mccandless set out on a journey of self-discovery. He traveled around the continent, staying with strangers and working odd jobs in order to achieve his dream of a nomadic lifestyle, free from the confines of a regular life. In the spring of 1992, he set out for a period of wilderness living in Alaska, something he figured might be the last leg of his journey, but he wasn't sure yet. Several months later, a group of moose hunters in the same area came across an old logger's bus. After they walked inside, they saw something that shocked them and sent them running out of the vehicle. There, lying on an old cot in one corner, tightly wrapped in a sleeping bag, was the remains of Chris. It took years to figure out what had happened, but based on sporadic journal entries, authorities were able to piece together a story. Chris had become trapped in the wilderness due to the rising level of a nearby river. He had crossed that same river very easily in the spring when he set out, and he didn't think much of it. Now, by the time he decided to leave in July, It had risen to a frightening level, and he was forced to retreat back to the bus. His food reserves were running low, and he wasn't having much success hunting, and he became desperate for food. In that desperation, he ate a poisonous wild plant that resembled an edible potato vine, and this led him to a slow and very painful death inside that bus. The reaction to Chris Mccandless's life is extremely polarizing. On the one hand, people will hold him up as a hero, a savior, and a role model to those of us who crave an alternative lifestyle. Now, on the other hand, some people, usually those who have some kind of wilderness experience themselves, consider him to be an idiot who disrespected nature by improperly preparing, and ultimately, he got what he deserved. But like with most things, there's nuance to this situation. I believe the truth of Chris lies somewhere in the middle. I think many people have a desire for adventure, as Chris did. As the famous saying goes, most men live lives of quiet desperation. And now that we've entered an era where the typical workday involves sitting in a cubicle for 8 to 10 hours per day, this statement is more relevant than it's probably ever been. Chris Mccandless believed this wholeheartedly, and to his credit, he had the courage to actually do something about his situation. It seems that so many of us are not content with our lives, and yet, for some reason, we refuse to actually change them. With that said, Chris didn't approach his adventure in a very diligent way. He was impulsive and failed to offer nature the respect that it demands. Nature can be a ruthless force. It's quick to take life without any feelings of remorse. Now, I was particularly interested in the reasons why Chris Mccandless made the choices he did. The book and the movie don't really provide much context in this area, and this was actually by design. At the request of Chris's sister, Into the Wild author John Krakauer was very careful and vague when describing the Mccandless family dynamics. But in Chris's sister's recent book, titled The Wild Truth, there's a very troubling reality that's revealed. Chris's father, Walt, was both physically and verbally abusive to his mother, Chris, and his sister, Corinne. And his mother was full of conniving deceit and manipulation. The Mccandless parents created a situation that was just so hostile that, in his own words, Chris divorced himself from them after he left. That's why they never heard anything from him during this 2-year-long adventure. He was a young man in an incredible amount of pain, and he must have felt that deep down, this journey would heal him in some way. Hopefully that knowledge can soften the hearts of anyone who doesn't offer Chris much grace. There's so much to unpack within Chris's 2-year adventure. The motives behind his actions, the damaging impacts of childhood abuse, and the courage to live an unorthodox lifestyle. But what are some concrete takeaways that we can learn from him? I've spent a lot of time over the years pondering this, and I've broken things down into 3 life lessons. Lesson number 1, the vast majority of the world is not out to get you. One of the most damaging aspects of social media these days is the fact that it presents us with a very distorted version of reality. And it's just so damn addicting at the same time. We'll spend endless hours scrolling through content that leaves us thinking that the world is this mean and hostile place. At the same time, it can also prevent us from actually getting out there and experiencing the real world, which is a much different place. Further to that point, one of the biggest things that struck me about the Into the Wild story is just how many friendly strangers Chris met during his travels. He ran into so many people who offered him companionship, work, shelter, and just about anything else that he needed. Even the last person that Chris saw before he set out into the wilderness was a man named Jim Gallion. Jim gave Chris a ride as far as he could drive, and knowing the danger that he was about to enter, he gave Chris his own pair of rubber boots. And there were so many other people like this along the way who would offer favors for no other reason than it was just the right thing to do. So this is an important reminder to us to reach out for help when we need it, even if it's from a total stranger, because the vast majority of the world is still filled with good people. Lesson number 2, happiness is only real when shared. For those of us who are maybe a little more introverted, there can be this big draw to being alone. There's a sense of comfort and peace that comes from being with our own thoughts. But again, balance is key here. I found in my own life when I've given in to this natural urge to isolate for too long, I seem to grow increasingly unhappy. I find that life just lacks that depth and joy that can only come from the company of others. During Chris Mccandless's fateful time in the Alaskan wilderness, he was reading a book called Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. There's a paragraph in that story that reads, "And so it turned out that only a life similar to the life of those around us, merging it without a ripple, is genuine life, and that an unshared happiness is not happiness." Beside that paragraph, in the last moments of his life, Chris scribbled the phrase, "Happiness only real when shared." This is particularly interesting because it goes so contrary to what we know of Chris. Chris Mccandless was self-reliant and determined to live his own life free from other people. It seemed like he was terrified of getting too close to anyone. He would frequently spend a week or two with strangers that he met along the way, and then he would just pack up and leave, sometimes without saying goodbye. I'm almost certain that you can trace this behavior pattern back to the years of mistreatment from his parents growing up. I think what he needed and what he was actually searching for in a roundabout way, deep down, was connection to other people. It's just a shame that he realized this far too late. This is an urgent lesson to us all that the path to happiness always lies in continued investment in those who are closest to us. Even if we've had experiences in the past that have left us jaded, it's essential that we don't let that get in the way of our joy in life. Lesson number 3, be courageous enough to live the life that you want. Perhaps Chris Mccandless's greatest strength was his ability to not care about what people thought of him. He was unimpacted by the desires of his parents and the many people he met throughout his life. He would listen to them, smile politely, and then proceed to do whatever the heck he wanted to do. In a letter to a friend, Chris wrote, "So many people live within unhappy circumstances and yet will not take the initiative to change their situation because they are conditioned to a life of security, conformity, and conservatism, all of which may appear to give one peace of mind, but in reality, nothing is more damaging to the adventurous spirit within a man than a secure future. The very basic core of a man's living spirit is his passion for adventure. The joy of life comes from our encounters with new experiences, and hence there is no greater joy than to have an endlessly changing horizon, for each day to have a new and different sun." Chris Mccandless was a young man struggling with the implications of an abusive childhood. He was impulsive and maybe a little foolhardy, but he also displayed incredible courage. The courage to charge through life, knowing that we only get one shot at it. Thanks for listening.